Good evening again, everyone. It's the middle session of the middle day of the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival, but there's nothing middling about what you're going to be hearing in the session. The festival is on its decennial and is titled The Second Becoming, a title that really carries a sense of hope. We welcome Priya Atwal, a historian of empire, monarchy, and cultural politics, who is going to be presenting her book, Royals and Rebels, The Rise and Fall of the Sikh Empire. Royalty continues to hold a fascination. It's about power and control and glamour, and in the colonial era, carried a whiff of debauchery and exoticism and danger. But the stories of the princely states are much more complex than just the exotic, and we are grateful to know that this book exists. So welcome, Priya. Really look forward to the session. In conversation with Priya is ELEANOR NESBITT, who has had a long association with the University of Warwick. She met Khushwant Singh in 1984. I'm sure that was very exciting. And a forthcoming book of yours that I'm really looking forward to reading and most curious about is Sikh, 2 Centuries of Western Women's Art and Writing. She is an expert on Sikh communities outside of India as well. The second conversationist is Serverpreet Singh, an expert on Sikh history and culture, both from the past and the present. In addition to his many publications is his podcast, Story of the Sikhs, that has a wide reach across many countries. We cannot open this session without pointing out that Khushwant Singh too wrote a book on Ranjit Singh, and now we have this new history, which is tremendously exciting, to lead us into the world of royal glory. Welcome, everybody. Priya, Serverpreet ji, ELEANOR, please welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Indiraji has mentioned my slight contact with Khushwant Singh, and I can't really resist sharing that with the audience today. My first contact indirectly with the great man was when I was working as a teacher in another hill station, not Kasoli, but in Nainital in Uttarakhand. And every week I would really enjoy reading the Illustrated Weekly of India. He didn't stop editing it until 1979. So during my period, which coincided with the emergency, I was relying on the Illustrated Weekly of India for some understanding of what was going on. And then when I came back to England, soon after I came back, I commenced a study of Sikh communities in Nottingham. And it was during that time that I came across Khushwant Singh's History of the Sikhs, the 2 volumes that you've heard about that are so readable. And they were certainly my point of access to the great sweep of Sikh history, including Maharaja Ranjit Singh's period. And it was probably because of the importance of that to my studies that I had the audacity to write a letter to Khushwant Singh before I came on a visit to India in a fairly historic year, 1984. And I don't remember exactly what I wrote in my letter, but in his letter, it was very brief. I think it was 2 lines long, one of those blue airmail forms. He welcomed me and he said, you know the Sikh predilection for the bottle. Will you please bring me 2? So rather timidly, with a Punjabi friend, I turned up in Sujan Singh Park, with only 1 bottle because my host lifted one off in the meantime. And I was very courteously and hospitably welcomed. And I do recall details, perhaps wrongly. I remember beautiful curtains that were printed with Urdu, or maybe it was Farsi. I think it was Urdu. I remember a cat, which was quite unusual when I went on visits in Delhi in those days. I don't remember anyone else having a cat in their apartment. And I remember Maneka Gandhi in the corner, Indira Gandhi's younger daughter-in-law, who refrained from joining in our conversation, but was there throughout. So those are my very slight, humble connections with the great man. But I've also got, I think, as has been mentioned, a connection with the subject matter of Priya's wonderful book. because my forthcoming book, which will have amazing illustrations, some of them by European women, has lots and lots of comments and accounts by British women who are in North India who mention Ranjit Singh and his family, his court. Actually, not all the women were in North India at the time. Queen Victoria wasn't, and she certainly mentions Maharaja Ranjit Singh's family quite a lot in her journal. But anyway, without more ado, I'm going to introduce Serverpreet Singh. As you've heard, he's a prolific writer, podcaster. He's also expert in electrical engineering and computer science, and is chief operating officer of a software company. I'm particularly fascinated by his publication, The Camel Merchant of Philadelphia. I confess that's because I'm a Quaker, and I've never heard of a madder, more unquakerly Quaker than The Camel Merchant of Philadelphia.
Indeed.
Maharaja Singh. And also, I'm really interested in The Dancing Girl of Lahore, which is about Bibi Moran. And I gather that you're immersed in Gurmat Sangeet and Indian classical music, though that won't be able to feature today, sadly, I guess. And then, of course, a final introduction to Dr. Priya Atwal, who I think I first met at the Punjab Research Group, where she gave at least one presentation during the period of her doctoral research, if I remember right. She joins us today, fresh from the 128th anniversary commemoration of Maharaja Dalip Singh's death. And she's currently at the University of Oxford, some of the time anyway, as a community history fellow, bringing together initiatives in the local community with academic historians and vice versa. And I think, Priya, that you're working on a forthcoming book on the life and image of Maharaja Dalip Singh. Anyway, I think what links these two splendid guests today is they both have a completely unputdownable style of writing, and they have both waxed eloquent on the Lahore court and Maharaja Ranjit Singh. So I suppose one way to start is to say, Priya, in a nutshell, what is your book's contribution?
I feel like I'm at my PhD Viva all over again. especially since Eleanor first met me when I was a very nervous first year doctoral student presenting my research. All those memories are coming flashing back. No, Eleanor was the friendliest person in the room, and it was lovely. It was a great experience. What is the contribution of my book? Well, I suppose the key area that I wanted to get across with my research is a different perspective on the inner workings of the Sikh Empire, of the dynasty at the heart of that empire. We've had some really fabulous and very insightful histories written about the role of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, about various of his male courtiers and generals, even down to European figures that were present in the Punjab at that time. And that's a field that obviously is expanding slowly but surely. But an area of both controversy and neglect, in my view, was the study of the women and the princes, so the core members of his family, of his lineage, beyond much of the colonial literature that exists, that quite heavily documents their activities, but in very particular kinds of ways. There have, of course, been some really fascinating biographies of the Maharani, the last Maharani Jindgaur, by Indian scholars. And I did very much follow in the footsteps of some of those writers, including Khushwant Singh's own Fall of the Kingdom of Punjab. So some of those texts were really formative for me in my early years of discovering this history. And like I was very interested to read in the introduction to some of SARBPREET's books that as another child of the diaspora, he didn't encounter Sikh history until a little bit later on in life, apart from stories that you hear in growing up at home or at the Gurdwara. Similarly, I too only came across the history of the Sikh Empire when I was at university for the first time. as an undergraduate student. And at the time, I was very much struck by the story of Maharani Jind Kaur to start off with, and then her son Maharaja Dalip Singh. And it was with a desire to understand their roles, their reigns, their life struggles, and the kind of political stereotypes that have come to circulate around them, both good and bad, that I started delving into their stories, but also then to unpack the roles of the women, the royal women and the princes as a whole through my doctoral thesis. And this book could easily have just been another biography of Maharani Jind Kaur, because she was in many respects my favorite queen for a long time. But when I uncovered so much more about the wider dynastic politics, and particularly the gender politics of the reign, I think what happened was I felt that it shone a different light on the inner workings of that empire and that kingdom and the politics of its time. And I felt that for too long those female or those younger perspectives had been neglected, and that also helps us to then understand the fall of the kingdom in a different way. So that's the arc that I've tried to convey in this narrative of, if reintroduce those perspectives, or at least if you ask questions about them or try to take them a little bit more seriously, how can we reimagine the history of Punjab and its encounter with British colonialism in this very pivotal period of the 19th century?
That's great. I'm assuming that some people have already had a chance to experience the wealth of material in your book, but for those who haven't, I think that's a tremendous introduction. And I wonder if Serverpreet, if you've got any questions that you want to ask Priya at this stage.
Not so much any questions, but I very much appreciate the manner in which you introduced your book. I have to confess that I was not able to read it completely, given the amount of time that I had. But I do find it fascinating. You have been very, very successful in a certain sense, centering the narrative of all the women who played an important role in the Sikh Empire. And, in my research, now you have to understand that my book was written several years ago. And while I'm returning to this period, my research is not very current. But I do remember finding little fleeting glimpses of reference to the different queens in a variety of writings, including Sohan Lal and the very gossipy, the real Ranjit Singh, written by one of the descendants of the Fakir family. What you've been able to do very effectively, I feel, is to bring all of that to the forefront. And in doing so, you've created a really valuable resource. So I am just starting to write the 4th season of my podcast, and I'm right at the rise of Ranjit Singh. And I can tell you that I know for a fact that your book will be very, very useful for my work as well as I.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. I'm really happy to hear that. Thank you very much. I mean, if I could just speak to that, I think the book is a product of the training that I have received as an academic historian, and I was for a long time interested in methodologies of gender and feminist history, and it's exactly how you said it. There's fragments of evidence with the role of the women and their influence in the political culture of the Punjab, scattered all over the place. And it's hard to then piece those out, but we need to pay attention to those fragments because they are important. And even though it might be a bit scattergun to pull it together, I think that's it. They're loose threads that if you do start weaving them together, show just how rich that political fabric was. And it is the work of several years. I was very fortunate to get on a PhD program to explore this. And there's still so much more to be done. I feel that the book that I've produced, it only really scratches the surface. There is so much more research waiting to be done across different archives, investigating other characters. I've looked at a very elite level of Punjabi society, one could say, but there's more to be done, amongst broader society of Punjab for that period of time anyway. but essentially, I wanted to contribute that kind of questioning approach, that we can actually do something with these fragments of historical knowledge or these snippets from different sources. And when we build all those pieces together, it can, enhance our understanding of that world. And I was very fortunate to have a lot of help from different quarters for this kind of thing. I had friends of mine who were helping me translate the Persian original of Sohan Lal Suri's text or of other manuscripts, because I wasn't able to progress fast enough with my Persian studies to do it all myself. Or I had photojournalists, heritage enthusiasts in Pakistan who sent me the photographs of Sheikhupura Fort, because unfortunately that building is not accessible today. So in that sense, it was very much a bringing together of lots of different people's skill sets that I then managed to put that together. Otherwise, it is a challenging task, but I think it has to be done. Otherwise, these important women, these important characters in the history of Punjab have been forgotten for too long, And that was my big reason for publishing the appendix at the back of the book with the names of all of the women that I was able to gather, because I really hope that other scholars, other young researchers will take that and run with it. And then who knows what else we could find.
That's really, really interesting. And I think it's so important, as it's very much in tune with the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival and its mission, its concern with the education of the girl child and so on. And perhaps this is a trivial question, or perhaps it's a very important question. You write about the Maharanis, the queens, those who had matrimonial alliances with Maharaja Ranjit Singh and other Maharajas. But were no girls born in the family? I mean, amongst my women, there is at least a rumour that Mehtab Kaur bore daughters and that they were replaced by Tara Singh and Sher Singh. Do we have any inklings at all about any girls being born into this family of Maharaja Ranjit Singh?
So this is something I'm still desperate to know more about, to be quite honest. As far as I was able to tell, I couldn't find any names of any daughters. There is a notebook that was kept by Maharaja Dalip Singh, and it's now in the collection of Peter Bance, who's a Sikh collector in the UK. And in that notebook, there's a list of the Maharaja's family members who were in receipt of pensions on the basis of the Lahore Treaty that was signed in 1849 when the kingdom was taken over. And so in that list, he has the various wives, widows, etc. of his father and his other brothers and their children and their dependents, for example. And in that list, there are daughters mentioned, to say one daughter for this person, one daughter for that person, but no names are given. And one doesn't even know if those daughters were surviving daughters or it was just that the mother bore a daughter and we don't know what happened to her. So that is something that it kind of breaks my heart a little bit as well, that we don't know who they were. We don't know what happened to them. There is no mention anywhere in any of the Persian or the courtly Dalbari sources about these girls. So I have not been able to find anything yet. And I will keep looking, trust me. But at this point in time, no. I mean, my concern, my suspicion is that if daughters were born, we know that this is an issue in Punjab and it has been for a very long time. But especially daughters of a Maharaja, I wonder if they were just gotten rid of at birth, because there would have been that question of who do you marry them off to? And if you want to project this dynasty as the ultimate power in Punjab, then in that kind of gender politics of that time, you couldn't have given that daughter to a more exalted house. It would have been an inferior match as such. So my worry in all of this is that, yes, that I think the daughters may well have, because, that many wives, how could there not have been a girl child on the scene?
And of course, that logic is the logic that's used to explain the absence of girls in the Bedi line.
Exactly.
Well.
Exactly. Which then goes to the complexity of Sikh political culture at this time, right? I mean, it goes against. This is where the kind of power politics of Punjab and the Sikh ideology are at melting in a sort of tension. It's not to say that, you know, it's always been a pure utopia within Sikh culture anyway, but it is that kind of issue. I mean, as I talk about with the queens, you know, none of them are fully able to rule in their own right. Chandragur has a brief glimpse of that, but even that ends really tragically. So that some of those tensions, you know, we do have to acknowledge, even though I understand people see it as quite a celebratory thing that I've brought the stories of the women forward, in terms of what we say as modern gender equality, or even in the ethos of Sikhi that we could say in its purest form, we don't see that enlivened in the court of Ranjit Singh or the dynasty of Ranjit Singh to its fullest extent.
Sorry, I was going to say that I have to confess that the appendix was one of the first things that I went to. And the reason for that is, when I was touring, when the Camel Merchant of Philadelphia was published, this was one of the questions that I was asked in almost every conversation, that, you know, Ranjit Singh had so many wives, so many concubines, it stands to reason that he must have had daughters. Do you know the name of even one? So I've been asked that question multiple times as well.
Yeah, it would be amazing to know, but so I have seen the mentions that there were daughters that existed, but no names, and that is really insane, I think. But who knows? You never know, somewhere a name might come up.
Not surprisingly, given what I've been working on myself over the last few years, another of the gaps that's a real concern for me is the absence of female sources for the history of this period. Priya, I know that you briefly refer to Isabella Fane and to the Edens, but my discovery has been of all these women, including Queen Victoria, who I mentioned, who either at first hand encountered the Maharaja and or his offspring, his descendants, or were very much aware through, for example, the newspaper coverage in Lucknow or whatever, were very aware of what was going on and who commented on it. And I'm intrigued that in your book, your sources, in line with almost all Punjabi historiography, are pretty solidly male.
Well, this is where I try to expand the canon just a tiny bit, with as much as I could anyway, with drawing on artistic sources, for example. So the paintings of Mina Gens, the frescoes in her apartments, was something that was a lucky find. And again, it's speculative analysis that I've done in the book about that, of what we might be able to glean from her personality or her views from the paintings that were on her walls. We can't know for sure that I was right or wrong.
Fascinating.
You know? Yeah. But in itself, this is where applying different kinds of historical methodology can help us, where the written evidence isn't there. Although we do, of course, have Rani Jindagor's letters, although those are, again, predominantly available to us in translation, translated by British colonial officials that are in colonial archives, apart from the few handful of Punjabi letters that are still around, that of course have thankfully been published also by the likes of Professor Gunda Singh, many years ago. So we have access, but you're right, there's really minimal material that's remaining to us. And so I really jumped on those fragments. So for example, I think it's Professor Gorawal and Indu Banga's collection of 450 Persian documents from the Khalsa Darbar records, there was one letter that was an order given by Maharani Gul Begum for some of the local officials to be removed from the Jagir, the landed estate that she had controlled in one part of Punjab. And it's a hukum, an order that she herself gave, and obviously that some official had written out for her. So those kind of things I jumped on, because that's effectively as close to the mouth of a Maharani that we can get to, if you see what I mean. But otherwise, I don't know, and as I'm sure you're very familiar with this, it's looking through the grains of reading between the lines of colonial sources and where women's voices appear. But also, yes, I found the writings of English women that were visitors to the Punjab particularly useful. So that's why I'm very much looking forward to your book, because I guess you get more of a sense of the woman-to-woman encounter in those scenarios.
Well, that's an interesting. I mean, my rather perhaps superficial observation is that race seems to trump gender, and in many ways, I mean, the women have the same limitations as the men from Europe in that they don't have knowledge of Indian languages for the most part. And I mean, Emily Eden says how very much she wishes that she could communicate and enter into the Maharani's world after her brief visit to the Zenana, but time didn't allow. And we also know, actually, from what she says in something she wrote when she was in Calcutta, that although she likes showing off her French, she basically regarded Indian languages as sort of so much gibberish. She didn't have the patience to try to tune into them. Even though having an interpreter must have been sort of quite frustrating for her and others who did want to get closer. But of course, at least with Emily Eden and some of the others, we've got the benefits of their artistic eye. But there again, she painted the men. She hardly painted the women, except for an intriguing picture of what appears to be an Akali family on horseback. And it appears that the Akali on horseback is actually a woman, is actually the turbaned and armed wife of the Akali Nihang, who is alongside the horse. But basically, she portrayed men just as the men did for the most part. So yeah, there are all these gaps, however hard one digs, and one's always looking for breakthroughs and more exciting discoveries. But it's not just English women, of course, who were around. I mean, a bit later than the actual period that we're talking about, there was a very loquacious and imaginative Russian woman in North India, Helena Blavatsky, who wrote at great length. And being of Russian background, she was not sympathetic with the British Raj, so she took a very different view of Maharani Jind Kaur from some of the British women writing about the royal family. So that's a sort of salutary counterbalance to the views of the English and Irish and Scottish commentators on what was going on.
That's it, and I think this is the thing. As you know, it's a cliche to say it, but the past is a foreign country, and there are so many limitations to our ways of writing history that we will never uncover the objective truth. And so I think in some ways, just to riff off what you're saying, I've read SARBPREET's recent works on this period, and I also reread in preparation for this session Khushwant Singh Ji's Fall of the Kingdom of Punjab. And it's funny because we all had slightly different takes on the story and the narrative and the rise and fall and that kind of stuff, and we could see it as you could see history as a progression of knowledge being accumulated and added to, and a picture being progressively changed in that process. Or you could also acknowledge the fact that we're all only going to ever produce what we can produce from our particular viewpoint, and maybe we will never know. I mean, if you compare my account to, for example, Khushwant Singh Ji's, he was very favorable, I thought, to Sher Singh in his account. And then it was interesting that he felt that Sher Singh should have been the Maharaja that would have potentially stabilized the situation in Punjab had it not been for the assassination of him by the Sandhwalias. Whereas in my account, you see that I interrogate the gender politics that Sher Singh engages in and how that destabilizes Jand Kaur's reign. And I mean, not that I'm actually arguing this, but you could say that I've set up a sort of a line of stability through the female line of succession as well, which Khushwant Singh didn't engage with at all. So if you're an average reader and you're not looking at the colonial sources, whose side are you going to, which historian are you going to go with? we cannot. And then I think what SARBPREET's work has done beautifully is to some extent, particularly on your work on the Gurus, the book on the Gurus, the story of the Sikhs, I thought was fabulous, is that, you know, to leverage the history, but draw it into a narrative, because at the end of the day, you know, without doing down my own discipline too much and saying there's no factual basis in there, which I'm not saying that at all, but we are on a spectrum, you know, if you see what I mean, of what we do with our narratives, and how close to an objective truth we can possibly be. And so to some extent, even though I'm trying to, you know, uncover and challenge stereotypes, uncover new snippets of knowledge and challenge stereotypes from, say, colonial literature that was in many ways deliberately biased, let's face it, there's only so far forward I can take the story. There's only so far I can say I've revealed something new, because I wasn't there. I can't claim it. So that the way in which I think all three of us engage with these questions of, okay, how much can we discover in an archive? How much can we glean from a painting that we haven't looked at before? What new things can that force us to think about? But I think we all have the challenge, don't we? You know, we can't truly capture what was going on. We can only offer our version, and in the hope that it will encounter and, you know, spark off a new way of thinking, a new way of feeling about this history in our readers. I'd love to muse on that question with you both, because I think right now, with the politics of the way that history is interacting with politics in different countries around the world, and how people are also searching for the real truth, the right history to hang their identity on, I think there's something in this that we also need to be careful, you know, with the claims that we make. So I'd love to throw that back to you both and see what you think.
Well, I let myself off the hook a little because I'm not a scholar by any stretch of the imagination, and not even a historian. I see myself primarily as a storyteller. So in that sense, I get much more license, or I give myself much more license. You're exactly right, Priya. I mean, there's only a certain extent to which you can find the quote unquote truth. From my, albeit narrow perspective, I've, find it much more interesting to find the accounts that really try to recreate that period in as vivid a manner as possible. And I take liberties. Some of the liberties that I take are, for instance, as part of an answer to an earlier question, when we were speculating about Ranjit Singh's daughters, the point that you made is definitely a valid one. Female infanticide was practiced at those times, and it's entirely possible that something like that might have happened. But as a storyteller who maybe writes more sort of, based on emotion to some extent, if you want to call it that, given everything that I've read about Ranjit Singh's character and his disposition, I would find it really, really difficult to believe that he would let one of his children be killed. Or do I have the basis to say that as a historian? Not at all. Not at all. But that's the kind of liberty that I argue a storyteller can possibly take, which a historian, unfortunately, can't. And, here, once again, for the readers, I have to applaud you for the diligence of your work. I mean, this is really a fabulous resource. It's a readable work, but it's definitely very academic. The notes are very, very detailed. So congratulations once again. I mean, you've really created something of great value. Not just for scholars, but even for storytellers like myself, because oftentimes there's a gap. I have to point to one thing. Pardon me for jumping around.
That's okay.
So one of the things that I encountered again and again, particularly in colonial writing, was the very unidimensional portrait of Khushwant Singh. And at the start of one of your chapters, you talk about this beautiful manuscript that was commissioned by Khadak Singh and mentions his son. So just unearthing that one piece of information and presenting it like you have, all of a sudden, depicts Khadak Singh in a completely different light. So,
Yeah.
really, really wonderful. But I'm sorry, I
No,
went.
thank you.
I'll turn it back to Dr. Nesbitt.
No, go for it.
No, that's great what you have said, and I would concur with it. One of the things I've loved about both the storytelling in both your works of history from both of you is the way you're in conversation actually with historians of the past, and both of you in one way or another are in conversation with Khushwant Singh, where you either endorse something that he said and take it a bit further, or say, well, actually I don't completely agree with what he said, for instance, about how much Maharaja Ranjit Singh actually identified himself as a Maharaja, or just the issue of the paternity of Tara Singh and Sher Singh, for example, when Khushwant Singh has made a statement and you either endorse it or differ from it. And one very small point, which I'll just mention, which may sound rather random, only 2 or 3 years ago, the V&A, the Victoria and Albert, loaned an exhibition of arts of the Sikh kingdom to the art gallery that's down the road from where I live. And in the middle of it was the throne of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And I found it fascinating, Priya, what you had to say about that, because Khushwant Singh writes it off. He says it's more like a bathtub than a fauteuil. It's more like presumably more like the sort of galvanized tub that sahibs and missionaries had in their bathrooms in India. Than it is.
I always found that a really funny quote. I did always use it in the book because I found it hilarious.
Yes.
It's good as a visual image, but I did want to take the throne a little bit more seriously. You're right.
So I love what you did, and you actually ennoble it and explain how its artistry is comparable to panels of Harmandir Sahib and so on, which is a valid point. But I just give that as an example. I think both of you have addressed points that Khushwant Singh made, and I don't know if you want to take up any of the others that either of you made, where you were referring to his work.
I think there's one thread potentially that we could think about, and that is what it meant to be a Sikh king, the idea of the monarchy. Because I noticed, SARBPREET, in your book, you followed the line about the Sikh politics being inherently Republican. And to be honest, that first chapter for me, the idea of to be a Sikh king, was the hardest one to write. It was not based on my own. That was the only one that was not based on my own primary research. It was an engagement with a whole host of political thought written by Sikh scholars, Punjabi scholars, and others interested in Sikh studies, Louis Fanik, for example, on ideas of Sikh ruling culture. And I also came at it with the view, if anyone was to go and read my PhD thesis, they would see that I initially came at this construct of Sikhi as a Republican body, in a sense, with the Khalsa, and I was trying to grapple in my first chapter of my PhD research about, well, how do we start off with a potentially Republican model and we switch to a Maharaja? This doesn't add up. And then so much of our language about, Guru Darbar and our ritual is so royal in its nature, even if you walk into a Gurdwara today. And so I was trying to kind of reconcile. I was like, where does the Republican side really ground itself then, if you see what I mean? And that is, in our most popular histories of the Sikh Raj, you have Khushwant Singh, you have Patwant Singh's works, and you have a little bit older than that, but Kapoor Singh's Parasara Prasna. And so I noticed that in SARBPREET, you'd also mentioned this. But what I found was interesting when I then delved into this much more deeply for that first chapter. And of course, my book was published after yours. So, it's in a way, it's a different narrative that I was then able to delve into. It struck me that there was a body of academic literature produced by scholars in Punjab that had already engaged with this question. And many years before, or around the time, but separately to Khushwant Singh writing his works, had actually settled that no, monarchy as an ideal and as a form of political language was so embedded in Sikh political thought. And then it was entirely natural for Maharaja Ranjit Singh then to arise as a king. But it's not to say that there weren't checks and balances and tensions with the way he exercised his power. And that was at the very heart of what Guru Nanak had initiated with the early foundations of the Sikh Panth. And so in no way really was this, this idea of a republic in some respects is a 20th century kind of vision put back on top of Sikhi in some respects, and arising from the very particular politics of that century and what was going on in the subcontinent as we were heading towards independence from colonial rule. And that for me was fascinating to engage with, in a way, to rather than take as a given what scholars such as Khushwant Singh and Patwant Singh had said, but actually then to contextualize them within the politics of their time, to contextualize their view of Sikh history and Sikh political thought, again, within the demands of their time. And, and then therefore reevaluate those older political formations of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's time, or even the way that the gurus were talking. And I mean, I can't claim to be in any way, shape or form a scholar of the guru's writings. I'm an ordinary Sikh, but I cannot claim to have, in any way, shape or form analyzed Bani deeply. But for those that have, I've leveraged that kind of language. And for me, it was useful then to form a bridge between the very royal nature of what Maharaja Ranjit Singh's kingdom was and what that earlier period was. And I don't know, I mean, Sarpreet, I would love to get your thoughts on that and how you responded to that part of the book if you did get a chance to read it, and what you thought.
Sure. So yes, I do have a couple of thoughts. So first of all, there are some aspects of your thesis that I find tremendously interesting. I completely buy into your argument that Ranjit Singh, despite perhaps the lip service that he was paying to the Republican ideals of the Khalsa Panth, was very aware of himself as a king and was very intent on perpetuating his dynasty and succession. I buy into that 100%. I mean, the man was, very, very smart. He knew that he had accomplished great things. And it's absolute human instinct that once you've got to that point, you want to pass it on to your family. So I have no argument with that at all. The Republican nature of the Sikh Panth, how real that was and how it sort of intersected with Ranjit Singh's rule, and whether you can draw a line, dotted or otherwise, from the royalty of the Sikh gurus to the royalty of Ranjit Singh is an entirely different matter. And let me say what I mean by that. There is absolutely no doubt about the fact that right from the time of Guru Nanak, even though the trappings appeared later, this notion of the Guru as king existed. It came to the forefront in the 6th Guru's time. And in the 10th Guru's time, all the visible trappings of royalty were there. There's a very interesting debate between Dr. Fenwick and Ami P. Shah, by the way, where Dr. Fenwick, who's a great friend, he's a very good friend of mine, talks about the sort of spiritual aspects of the Padshahi versus the temporal aspects of the Padshahi. And Dr. Ami Shah sort of negates that very, very effectively. But let's set that aside for a second. We do know, well, within quotes, because this is the storyteller knowing as opposed to the historian knowing, that when time came for Guru Gobind Singh to depart, he anointed the Guru Granth Sahib as the spiritual leader of the Sikhs. That is something that all of us accept almost without question. Now, we also kind of accept the fact that he turned the temporal power of his station back over to the Sikhs, to the Khalsa Panth. as sort of represented by institutions such as the Panj Pyare, as represented by the institution of the Sarbat Khalsa and the Gurmatas that came out of the Sarbat Khalsa. So I think that that is something that is largely accepted. I would say that the history of the Sikh Panth in the 18th century in particular, as the Mughal Empire was collapsing, as the repeated invasions, first from Persia and then from Afghanistan, sort of created turmoil in Punjab and created sort of the perfect situation for the Sikhs to rise, you actually saw that Republican ethos very, very clearly in terms of how the Sikhs were organized, first into the 60 plus bands and then into the 11 or 12 missiles, depending on what one thinks of the Fulkiyas. So you saw that Republican ethos very, very clearly. So to me, and by the way, if you'll allow me to be tongue-in-cheek for just a second, you cite the Prem Samarak Granth and talk about the fact that a Sarbat Khalsa and Gurmata is not mentioned in the Prem Samarak Granth as sort of pointing to the fact that the Gurmata institution was not very important.
Not that it wasn't important, just that it's interesting that the text didn't
mention it.
Yeah.
Fair enough. So Prem Samara Granth kind of lost me in that section where it talks about burying a Muslim woman up to her neck in sand and feeding her pork for 51 days to purify her if she wants to marry a Sikh. I'm being tongue-in-cheek. Well, what I'm trying to say is that the fact that the Gurmata doesn't appear in the Prem Samara Granth to me is perhaps not that significant. We do know that even in the time leading up to Ranjit Singh's becoming the emperor and taking over Lahore, there were Sarbat Khalsas in which important decisions were made. I have not been able to find any solid resource that talks about a Sarbat Khalsa in which Sadakaur actually got up and rallied the Sikhs and convinced them to fight. There is a small reference in Khushwant Singh's book, but he doesn't really cite his source. But again, I have no difficulty believing that Sadakaur would have stood up before the Sarbat Khalsa. But the important point is the Sarbat Khalsa is where the decisions were made. And if we go back to the previous decades, in the times of Nawab Kapoor Singh and Jassa Singh Ahluwalia, we find multiple references to that. So my 2 cents is that the Republican ethos was very, very real. And in a certain sense, that's what created the climate for Ranjit Singh to succeed. And by the way, we judge, everyone from the past all the time. We can be judgmental about Ranjit Singh and say that he destroyed the Republican ethos of the Sikhs, and that, in a certain sense, precipitated the decline of the empire. That actually might be true. But from Ranjit Singh's perspective, he had become the king. He had power. So from a point of view of governance, it would have been stupid for him not to emasculate the other missiles, because only by becoming the singular source of power could he rule. So all of that made tremendous sense. So just to bring all of this back together, my 2 cents would be that the Republican ethos and the Republican nature of the Sikhs in the 18th century was very real. It came directly from the turning over of temporal power to all Sikhs by Guru Gobind Singh. Ranjit Singh was not the only one who tried to make himself a king. Baba Ala Singh became a king before Ranjit Singh, and his progeny continued to rule until Indian independence. So the notion of a Sikh chief wanting to be a king was not unique. And Ranjit Singh succeeded beyond anyone else, including Baba Ala Singh. But to draw a line between the Padshahi of Guru Gobind Singh and the Padshahi of Ranjit Singh, in my view, is a bit of a stretch for all of these reasons. Doesn't detract from his success.
To very briefly respond, because I know we've got to go for questions soon, is I just take issue with the word republic. What I think what we have is a strongly radically egalitarian ethos, but I take issue with the word republic. I think following the work of Bunramadavan, of Louis Fenwick and others that have done very nuanced analysis of the 18th century, I think there is a sentiment and a political radicalism in what you've just said that is there. So I would not say it was a republic. I would say it was a bunch of everyone who was individually kings or queens. If you take the Singh and Kaur as its true designation, a bunch of everyone being royal with only some reaching the level of Maharaja. And I think that is the inner tension that exists right to the end of how do you then be the king amongst kings, essentially, if you see what I mean. So that, in a way, I think the use of the word republic is a Western later 20th century imposition, but actually you've got a very different nature of kingship diffused throughout, if you see what I mean, the Sikh people. But how do you bring that to light in a Punjab that is also majority Muslim and Hindu and other religious groups? That's something I think it would be fascinating for us to think about another time. But I to be honest, it's a difference of degrees between us, not of stark, I
agree.
You see what I mean? But
That's wonderful.
But thank you.
Yeah, thank you to you both. I think the questions look interesting. So shall we move into them? The first
Absolutely.
one is about the interesting portraits of Maharani Jindal Kaur. Who were the portraitors? Did they make any notes about her? I don't know who wants to take that one first.
My mind just gone blank about the name of the artist who made the portrait. I think it was someone George Richmond, but that could easily be wrong. My brain's just gone blank.
I think I agree with you.
Is that right? Oh my goodness. I don't know if
right.
knows.
It sounds right.
I have nothing to contribute, unfortunately.
I think so. But whoever that was, I'll tweet it later. I was thinking Beachy for a second, but no, he was the one that did the first portrait of Maharaja Dalip Singh when he was a very little boy. When he left the Punjab. But I think it was
the last picture of him in Punjab. That's right.
Yes. I don't know if any notes exist from the encounter. I know that there's some sketches exist that were the studies that the artist did before he actually painted the full portrait. So I don't know which private collector has those, but I've seen them around somewhere.
What I find really interesting is that actually that portrait, to me, portrays a powerful, attractive, physically robust person. And yet you've got Lena Logan, who with her husband had been looking after Dalip Singh before he came to Britain. And when she sees the Maharani in London, in Kensington, I think, she sort of says how she's this poor old woman and how she feels a real sympathy for her. But she must have just been in her 40s.
Yeah.
I mean, what we would regard as her prime. I find that really interesting. Okay, Lena Logan wasn't an artist, but she did make notes. She did comment on the appearance of the Maharani.
I think we do know that Jind Kaur's sight had deteriorated quite significantly, at least. But in terms of her overall health, because there was a letter that was found that Dalip Singh wrote to her before they were reunited, asking how her eyesight was doing and if she was still struggling with some sort of illness around her eyes. So that much we know. But in terms of her overall physical health, it's quite an intriguing question there.
There is a wonderful description of her appearance when she was first in London, when she actually wore an outfit of British clothes over her Punjabi clothes and had to be more or less hoisted up the stairs because she was so weighed down.
I mean, I'm just desperate to know if there's a photograph of her somewhere, because we know that Maharaja Dalip Singh was an avid photographer. And there's multiple photos in the royal collection that he took of members of the royal family when he learned how to do photography with them. Obviously, the first photographs of it that were taken of him in many respects were those taken in 1854 in the holidays when he went to stay with them at Osborne House. Those iconic pictures of him standing at the terrace at Osborne. So how did he not take them of his mother? Did she not? If she allowed for a portrait to be painted, surely there must be photographs too, but we haven't found those yet. And to think that there could be pictures taken by Dalip Singh of his mother, that would just be mind-blowing, I think, to find one day.
Oh, let's keep hoping. But perhaps we should move on to the question that's addressed to you, Sarvarpreet. Can you tell us the significance of music in Maharaja Ranjit Singh's life?
Unfortunately, I don't have anything very useful to say other than the fact that numerous visitors to his court talked about the singing and the dancing, and some of the European observers said that the singing was horrible and sounded like screeching, which, as someone who has a passion for Indian classical music, I found rather amusing. And we have references, of course, to dance and his what some of the observers called his brigade of Amazons who were called upon to put on a show for the visitors. But beyond that, unfortunately, I haven't really delved into anything very, very interesting about music specifically in Ranjit Singh's court. Sorry, I don't have a better answer.
No, I should add, I can't add anything further, but a good friend of mine, Radha Kapuria at Sheffield University, will be publishing her first book on this very subject about music and dance in Ranjit Singh's Punjab and then colonial Punjab as a full book next year in May. So do look out for that if whoever asks that question, because it will be, she equally wrote her PhD thesis on the topic. So hopefully she'll be someone that you can speak to next year.
Yeah, I was going to mention Radha Kapuria's name. But let's move on to the next question if we've got a minute or two. Was it true that the British didn't contemplate waging war against the Khalsa Darbar? They just wanted to have a buffer against Russian invasion. Or Ranjit Singh's was a truly formidable kingdom to be usurped easily. So yes, did the British want to wage war, or did they just want a buffer?
This is the ultimate controversy, isn't it? I mean, in a nutshell, it was the policy to maintain it as a buffer state, for sure, for as long as possible. But it's undeniable that British policy and military planning became increasingly hawkish as the 1840s progressed. And I mean, I err in the book on the side of suggesting that the war was, to an extent, pushed from the British side, particularly through the backstage dealing with Gulab Singh. I think it became increasingly clear that the East India Company officials, Harding's policy in particular, were not happy with the state of play at Lahore under Maharani Jind Kaur, and would rather have seen the breakup, not necessarily the wholesale annexation of the entire kingdom, but its breakup into a more manageable set of chunks, if you see what I mean, in order to create multiple buffers that could more easily be controlled, as well as neutralizing the more mutinous side of the Khalsa army, which is what happens then in 1845-46. Jammu and Kashmir is separated off to Gulab Singh, who is then very loyal to the British government. The eastern half of Punjab is annexed, which is an incredibly rich, incredibly fertile area of land. And Sikh soldiers and Punjabi soldiers are very quickly then started to be recruited into British employ. And then the rump, the other third of the Lahore state, remains under Jind Kaur and Dalip Singh under very tight watch. And it's that Harding says to Henry Lawrence, it would be good to keep this as a buffer state up until Dalip Singh's majority. But, very quickly, once Dalhousie arrives on the scene, the tide completely turns because he's got no interest in engaging with Indian royalty, which, the amount of states that he, of course, takes over tells its own story.
Thanks so much. I think we're up against time, but we have had one answer as well as questions. So Fakira Ijazuddin confirms that it was George Richmond who painted that.
Fantastic.
And I think that in some ways you've covered the questions that would have been put to us about Ranjit Singh being a secular king, and how did Ranjit Singh manage to keep the leaders united when the British couldn't, and then just divided and defeated them. I apologise to people whose questions required longer answers. I hope there's a way.
I'm happy to take questions over Twitter if that's easier. Later on. I'm happy to take questions over Twitter if anyone would like to send anything through.
And I'm happy to take questions over email. But for my part, I'd like to thank you, Priya, and you, Sarverpreet, for such an interesting conversation.
Thank you very much to both of you and to the organisers of the festival. It's been amazing to be a part of this.
Yes, I second that. Is there any, yes, Indira, is there something which you would like to
Well,
say to
there's
us at this
tons of
point?
questions I have. I'm so curious. I'm sitting here in Bangalore. I'm curious about connections to the southern kingdoms. Was there ever any sort of interaction between them in the way administration was structured, how they dealt with colonial powers? So many questions, but I think that all of that will have to be taken offline. It was a fascinating, wonderful, wonderful session. I learned so much. Priya, I appreciate very much your acknowledging the line of study and your scholarship from where you come, and the fact that you addressed it from a feminist point of view, addressed this whole issue from a feminist point of view, was fascinating. I appreciate that very much. What a wonderful introduction to to the whole session by Eleanor Nesbitt. I mean, and I love the story about your engagement with Khushwant Singh himself. And Sarpreet ji, you were just like a font of knowledge. So I was just completely absorbed in this session. Thank you so very much, and look forward to more engagement and to reading your book. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Right.